Hello, everyone. I'd like to welcome our viewing audience to another exciting session of our Ed Talk series. I am Andrea Ferrari, CEO and founder of Host Schools International, where we have created this innovative space to inspire conversation around education during these unprecedented times. Education is being transformed, and at Host Schools, we believe that equity, well-being, and happiness are the key to driving a change that is sustainable, future-proof, and can face the consequences, both short and long term. And in order to raise awareness around this movement is that we gather here with experts in the educational sector, opinion leaders who can guide our educational communities with their international perspectives as we co-create the new landscape in education. We are very excited today to welcome Jennifer D. Klein from Principled Learning Strategies. Our topic for today is ensuring equity during and after the COVID pandemic. And Jennifer has been an inspiration to the education sector, firstly as a student herself who went through very interesting experiences that led her to innovate and inspire as a college professor, as a leader in Latin American international school communities. Jennifer is a consultant and a workshop leader and founder of Principled Learning Strategies, where she has authored a book and a new exciting one on the way. Jennifer, welcome to Jennifer and Gabriela, who will be co-hosting with us tonight. Welcome. It's a pleasure to have you with us today, dear Jennifer.
Thank you so much for the invitation.
Excellent. And with that, I'm going to open with an introductory question to guide our discussion today, Jennifer. And first of all, what is it that we really mean when we want to ensure equity in education? And what would inequity look like? There seems to be a little bit of a misconception or a mix-up between those two terms, equity and yes.
Right, and equality would be the other one that causes us trouble, equity, right?
Yes.
Right. So that's the first thing that I think is important for us to clarify, especially in educational circles. Equality means the same for everybody, right? Equity means what each child needs or what each person needs. And so equity challenges vary from country to country and from community to community. In the United States right now, for example, a lot of inequity, a lot of situations where not all students are being served in a way that allows them to learn and to be successful and to thrive and be well in their schools and in their homes, stems from issues of race, from differences of gender or identity, based often on where the school is located. To some degree, equity can be a question of funding as well, but it really depends on where you are. I did a lot of work for many years in a community, large community in Sierra Leone, where the biggest equity challenge that we had was that girls had no access to sanitary supplies during their periods. And with no bathrooms at the high school either, the inequity was that girls were out for 5 to 6 days every single month because they had no other choice. So how you confront an inequity like that, right, through what we did, which was reusable sanitary pads and programs to teach the girls how to handle them and building bathrooms and all of those kinds of things, that allowed there to be equity of access to the schoolhouse and to the school experience, right? I think we're also talking about special needs, right? We're talking about whether students with special learning needs are getting the supports that they need. Really what we're talking about is making sure that no students are facing significant barriers that would keep them from being able to learn and to thrive.
Jennifer, would you agree that it's also a question of how to personalize learning in a way that can really pinpoint the talents of each child? Because that even takes it, I think, further, right?
Absolutely. There's no question that any kind of a pedagogy that's personalized or student-centered, right, using that bigger frame as well, is very much about making sure that each child is receiving the scaffolds they need. The challenge, though, can be that very often the implicit, unseen bias, the unrecognized bias of a given educator can also create really significant inequities in those situations. In other words, if I'm personalizing learning in my classroom, but I've convinced myself that these 3 or 4 students, for whatever my reasons might be, are not going to thrive the same way, I'm going to set expectations and personalize in a way that lowers the expectations rather than taking them as far as we can go. And that's what the new book is actually going to focus on, is how do we use a more asset-based approach when we think about what students need and where they can go and how far they can go, so that we personalize it in a way that brings out those talents and really monopolizes on their gifts, and also works on their areas of weakness, of course, but without impressions from the teacher or biases from the school or the district or the community limiting what the possibilities are.
Okay.
Thank you. And with that in mind, the idea of moving from this notion of all students having access to actually making them all be successful and reach their full potential, the topic of your new book, we're so excited because Jennifer is going to be co-authoring, and she'll also be co-hosting our Leaders Forum in January with her colleague Capona Ciotti, and we'll be discussing these strategies. How does this look, or what are the challenges then, Jennifer, that schools can face as they're working to a more equitable inclusion and opportunity for all of students?
Well, I think the trajectory has been a little bit different depending on what part of the world you're in. What we've seen in the United States, certainly, is that we started with the term multiculturalism, right? About 40 years ago, 30 years ago, we were talking about multiculturalism in education, which meant that we were making sure that there were lots of cultural conversations and, international festivals and things like that. We recognized at some point along the way that just filling the classroom with multicultural images was not quite enough. And so the movement shifted toward diversity, where the goal was to see this sort of mix of different races, religions, identities in one educational space, all of them interacting, all of them thriving, collaborating, knowing how to overcome their conflicts with each other. But even diversity was a bit of a low bar to set, because diversity really invited that there be all of these differences in the classroom, but didn't always train teachers for what it looked like to work with those differences. From there, the movement moved to the term inclusion, but over the last few years, even that term has become problematic. What we're talking about is an educational system that's based on a power structure, right? Where some people have more and have the right to dictate what other people need to learn. And the moment that it became about inclusivity, it unfortunately included that concept that that there are some in power and they're choosing to include those who don't have power. Right? It's a little bit like that word empowerment, right? It's problematic because, yes, obviously having power is good, but it implies that somebody has the ability to give it to you, which means you didn't have it to begin with, and it required somebody gifting it to you. So the new term now, and I know this is really complicated, but the new term now is belonging. And it's all about making sure that every single child feels a deep sense of belonging in their classroom with their peers, and that when conflicts come up, because they will, and when challenges come up, because they will, that they know that they have the support, that they know that they're safe, they know that they can learn, they know that the people around them believe in them and will champion them. For me, I think a lot of that culture shift in the classroom requires making sure that there's more control over what happens in schools from the local level as opposed to government, because I think every school is different and every classroom is different. And in most cases, it's the principals, it's the teachers who are working directly with the kids who know best what it is that they need the most. But for sure, the challenges are many, including that issue of implicit bias that I mentioned before, which can be based on a million different factors, right? Who do we perceive to be capable of what, and how do we help them get there? And I think personally, if we try to perceive every single student as an absolute rock star, we can get every single student to that rock star level.
That's a
And
really
do you
nice
think it's a question of, oh, I'm sorry, Andrea. Do you think it's a question of teachers reframing that approach to students, or how do you see that happening?
Well, some of it is about giving kids the skills, right? And helping kids to understand that differences are valuable, right? They're not something, I mean, I think at certain age groups, kids naturally will see differences as funny or silly or strange, right? And it's always the job of the teacher and the parent to unpack that feeling that something is silly, right? I remember actually once overseeing a video conference at a boys' school in San Francisco with a classroom in Mexico. And the school in Mexico, the kids were doing their best to speak in English, and the kids in San Francisco were giggling at their accents. And so we had to pause the video conference for a moment and ask them questions about how their spoken Spanish sounded, right? And help them understand that everyone, when learning a new accent, has a different sound to the way that they speak, and really help the kids to kind of deconstruct, why does it make us giggle? And where is that coming from? And how can we, right? So you have to give the kids the skills to connect with each other, to understand each other in a deep way, to ask the hard questions and be ready for difficult conversations sometimes when there are differences of religion or politics or whatever it may be. And again, this is going to be a different scenario in every country. In Colombia, I remember noticing that it was more often a political issue than it was a racial issue, whether all students felt like they were heard or felt safe to say what they believed. So I think it will always depend on the context. So part of it is very much giving the kids the skills, but to do that, obviously, the leaders and the teachers as well need really deep training in what it means to understand, and not just, again, there's this movement in the United States that use the frame of tolerance, right? And it's a wonderful, wonderful movement with amazing resources for teachers. It's called Teaching Tolerance, and it was developed by the Southern Poverty Law Center, and it's extraordinary. But that word tolerance, again, leads to too low a bar. A tolerance suggests that I've learned to put up with you, but not that I've learned to understand or accept who you are. So I think that a lot of it, for me at least, a lot of it comes down to that intercultural and the dynamics between students of different identities, whether that's gender, sexual identity. I mean, there are a million ways that kids will go at each other, or there are a million ways that educators can help to make sure that they learn to understand each other.
I really like the way that you suggested that this is a continuum, and where we started and where we're striving to be, and how, depending on the context and the culture of each school, you're going to be flowing within that continuum, that it can be interchangeable. What maybe advice would you give now during COVID, and how has all this come to impact or accelerate or make us even more aware of something that was already very prevalent? How would you describe that? How has that impacted on?
Well, before I even respond to that, I appreciate your comment about the continuum, and I want to clarify for everyone watching that there is no wrong place to be on the continuum either. Just because I describe belonging as an ideal goal doesn't mean that you are in deep trouble if you're still in multiculturalism, right? It just helps to set the goal, right? So anywhere on that spectrum is a good thing, especially if we're moving toward that deeper sense of belonging. I think COVID has complicated the heck out of what it really looks like to have equitable access to quality education. And I think that's true all over the world. And I spend a lot of time trying not to panic over the impact that all of this is going to have in the long term as much as the short term. First of all, I think most of us remember that in the year 2000, the United Nations presented us with the Millennium Development Goals, and the one on education was access, right? It was access to education. And And we did some really good work over the course of 15 years. Significant strides were made when it came to all students around the world having access to an education. The Sustainable Development Goals, which the UN rolled out in 2015, ask for quality education. And it was the shift that I was waiting for, right? Just access doesn't mean much if what you have access to is not high quality. And so it's a question not just of access, but of quality. The problem is that COVID's brought us back to access challenges, right? So what we have are huge, huge portions of the world with no access to any sort of direct instruction of any kind, no access to education. In a lot of places, just schools shut down completely and education stopped. Depends on where you are, obviously, how bad that is, but particularly in areas where students don't have internet, where they maybe don't even have electricity, much less computers, having access to a quality education is really, really, really challenging. But even in the best districts in the world, even in the fanciest private schools, I think folks are finding that even when kids have computers and have the basic technologies and infrastructure that they need to learn from the household, that they don't necessarily, not all kids are thriving online, right? And the hybrid is working for some and not for others, so I think in a lot of ways, what this moment invites us to do is to remember that learning can happen beyond the schoolhouse, right? And it can actually happen beyond the teacher if it's done well.
Yeah, I actually want to just comment for a second with Gabriela. We've become quite aware of what you mentioned. Now it's even the kids that are at home and have the devices and have the technology, learning isn't happening. And we know, and we're big supporters of this, that there is no learning without well-being. And I know that you're very much looking into that with your new book, Jennifer. I would love for you to, before we go to the next question, maybe give us a tip or some advice. How would I even begin to acknowledge that and weave it into this fabric of equity as I think about the learning component, the well-being component?
Well, I think what well-being should actually be our first priority right now. I mean, to be quite honest with you, when people ask me, what do I think we're going to do with everybody so behind? My response is always, well, if everybody's behind, then nobody is, right? Maybe we all need to get off the hamster wheel for a minute, right? And recognize that we are dealing with a global crisis, and how our kids feel and how they're doing is actually way more important than whether they passed pre-algebra. And in the big picture of things, that's what they're going to remember about the pandemic, is how they felt and how it felt to be isolated from their peers, not the content that they learned. So I would love to imagine us just taking a little bit of a step back and just recognizing let's do some place-based learning in our homes. I have a colleague who was doing geometry with her daughters, basically ignoring what was going on in the classroom, but teaching them the same things through their doing quilting with their grandmother. You know what I mean? Like, that strikes me. And I've heard wonderful stories about students learning measurements and all sorts of other things, and chemical reactions and those kinds of things from cooking with the family. So I think when there's intention, any experience is potentially educational. The challenge is that we're dealing with an educational system all over the world that was created in the Industrial Revolution, and it's all about that hamster wheel, or that the factory production line, right? And we feel like we've fallen off the factory line, and it scares us. And I understand the fear, especially for parents and teachers of students in 11th or 12th grade, right at the end of high school, preparing for college. It's scary as heck, and I understand why. But I also think that it has the potential to really invite us to rethink what we're doing this for anyway. And if my teenager is so depressed and so unwell in this isolation, that all she needs is time and conversation and play, and to lie on her back in the sun, and to whatever it is that helps, I would rather give her that than worry about how she's doing in algebra.
Well, it goes back to the feeling of belonging, no? At the end of your spectrum is what we're striving for, and belonging in every sense. I know that Gabi is a big fan of this movement of belonging.
Yeah.
No, definitely. And I love what you said about, I think where's the focus? Is the focus on what the students are learning, or is the focus on the students that we are helping to educate and to grow? And
right.
And that's the question, no? Because when we talk about education, students being behind, it's really focused on the content, it's focused on the program, and it's not focused on, yes, but this year is not a complete loss. Their experiences that, as you said, if you add intention to them, then they will be very plentiful of learning, of knowledge, of wisdom, I think, no?
Absolutely so. Well, and I think too, it's important to imagine after COVID as well. I know sometimes it's very hard to imagine that there is an after, but we know that there has to be, right? And we know that that right now we have these challenges. Those schools that are doing some in-person learning are having to do it with kids at 6 feet apart, right? They're having to do it with kids masked and teachers masked. And I worry all the time about what that does to the culture of a classroom too, right? As we move back into something a little bit more familiar, I don't want it to look like the 1920s again. Do you know what I mean? I don't want it to look like every kid facing in the same direction. I think one of the things that's worth noting, and this has been true for me as an introvert, I think actually introverts are largely thriving during this time. They're just fine holding up, or we're just fine holding up and just doing our thing for a while, right? But when they're confronted with their peers again, when they need to go back into the classroom, it's going to be like the first day of preschool again for every single one of them, no matter what their age is, right? Because their ability to socialize face to face will have been hurt by this. And so I think that's the other thing to think about is, what does it look like to bring them back to school? I know a lot of schools are going to be really, well, and again, it depends on where you are in the world. Lots of countries have gone back to school. Some countries have had to close again. But I think it's easy to fall into this mistake of, oh, we've got to catch them up. So they're back now. So now we've got to slam them with 5 chapters a night until we get them back to where they were supposed to be at this age. And that terrifies me, and it makes me fear that the mental health challenges that we're seeing now will just get worse when they return to school. Because at least right now, there's a little bit less pressure.
Yeah, it sounds to me like you're talking a lot about this term resilience together with well-being, and how are we going to be able to foster and nurture that so that when they do come back, this resilience is really the piece that allows them to make a smooth transition, and not only student body, but the teachers and ourselves included. And I love this quote that you have on your website. An increase in resilience comes from the steady dedication to something larger than ourselves. And I think once again, it's about belonging. Do you want to comment on that, on the path to purpose?
Absolutely. That quotation comes from the adolescent psychologist William Damon at Stanford, who found in his very deep research that we actually don't have an epidemic, or at least we didn't 5 years ago, an epidemic of depression and anxiety in our teenagers. What we have is an epidemic of purposelessness. We have young people who don't understand why school matters, and the pandemic has made that even worse, right? So I believe that this is actually a perfect time to be teaching resilience and really fostering it in the home and in the school. One of the activities that I did with parents at Gimnasio Los Caobos before I left there as head in Colombia was that I did a workshop with parents which I asked them to replicate with their kids at home, where I asked them to create 2 lists, one list of all the things that they can create, that they can control, whether inside or outside the house, and then another list of all the things that they couldn't control inside or outside the house. This would have been in May of 2020. And of course, the lists of things they couldn't control were very, very long, but the takeaway was very clear for all the parents. There are a lot of things on my other list that I can in fact control and that I've been sitting around feeling paralyzed by. And so I need to stop worrying about those things that I can't possibly control and focus my energy on what I can control. And that bigger dedication, that steady dedication to well-being, I think is a perfect example of having a higher goal and making sure that that inside your home and inside your schools as well, of course, that there's a lot of space for that kind of well-being and the building of that kind of resilience. Because this is unlikely to be the last pandemic we encounter. This is very unlikely to be the last catastrophe these kids will deal with in their lifetimes. What's most important here is that they come away well and with the ability to confront these kinds of challenges in the future.
Yes, a toolbox. Agreed. Agreed, very much agreed. Gabi, I don't know if you have any other comments or questions. I definitely think that going back to resilience, it's about thinking of it as a skill, something that can be taught, it can be learned at a very young age, and it can be practiced. And it's just like happiness, and those are at the core of what we believe at Whole Schools, and few people know. Jennifer, and the examples you just illustrated are great to drive it home, but few people know that those can be taught, that they can be learned, and we can get better at doing it. And if the younger we do it, and the younger we give our children that toolbox to take home, Gabriela's an expert. She has for a long time developed those social emotional learning skills, and we know that is what is driving this transformation. So thank you for putting it so concretely. We still have about 4 little minutes, and we would love to give you a chance to describe to us what you hope the future might bring when it comes to equity in education. And I know you mentioned all the different dimensions, the gender, race, the differentiated learning, and certainly not making it about access, but about success for every child. So what would you leave us with today if we're a school that is nowhere on the continuum and we're just coming alive and coming back? What's one of the things that we could keep in mind or not lose sight of, maybe, Jennifer?
Well, something you just said about resilience changed part of my answer to this question too, because one of the things that I keep thinking about is the role of the parent and the teacher as model, right? And I think if the parents are modeling panic and a lack of resilience, and panic over the quality and this question of, are you going to get what you're supposed to get out of your education? I think that just makes it worse, right? So when I imagine that better future, that more equitable space in education, I think it starts with the recognition that there are extraordinary change makers in every single community in the world. Potential change makers, sorry, started thinking in Spanish. Again, it goes back to what I was saying at the beginning about implicit bias. We often assume that one community, because of lack of resources, because of less trained teachers, is not going to be able to produce the same things that a fancy private school would be able to produce. And I think that's a mistake in thinking. I think that any school can create an equitable environment. Some of it's about money, but it's definitely not entirely about money, right? It is about hiring good quality teachers and training them well. So there is a financial piece to it. But I think more than that, it's the will to see every child that way, right? And the will to build an education that really allows every single young person to thrive and that brings out the best in them, that helps them find their sense of purpose so that they feel an authentic drive and passion in their lives. An education where they feel seen and recognized and appreciated for what they bring to the classroom, as well as supported in improving in the areas that they need to improve in. Again, I mean, I think that applies to all of these conversations. I mean, I know in the U.S. There's a need for some deep anti-racist work. There's a need for some anti-hate work, right? That's just basically around learning to honor each other's experiences and stories, and talents and challenges, and really learning to pull out from other people all that they have to give and to offer, and all of that, right? So I think and that's my dream, right? And my dream is to see it happen, not just in the schools with tons of resources. And in fact, actually, it's a mistake to think that the private schools have a whole lot more, because they don't actually in many cases. But I don't think it's just a question of money. And I think we make a mistake if what we say is, well, this given population can't reach that goal because of X, Y, or Z. Let's, especially if it's a financial one, I really think it's much more about the will to see in every single human being in that classroom, somebody who has the capacity to make the world a better place, make their community a better place, make their home a better place on whatever scale it might be, and to really try to help them thrive.
I love these closing comments. We're at 20 seconds, but just to acknowledge the beautiful sentiment that is expressed in this, the treasured idea that we can all belong once again, and the treasured idea that each child is unique, and that our diversity is what really makes each and every one of us thrive and special. At Host Schools, we believe that together everyone achieves more. So
absolutely.
Thank you, Jennifer. Way to go. Thanks today for all of your knowledge, for sharing it. We know where we can reach you, and we welcome you in our forum January 30. Gabriela, I don't know if you have some closing remarks as well.
I loved everything that Jennifer said. I think it's something that is very important that is heard, that educators, we align ourselves towards these goals, and just thank you so much for being with us.
It's my pleasure. I'm so glad that these conversations are happening. I hope that the educators who see this video find the strategies and ideas useful. And remember that we are part of a huge network of educators all over the world who want to do it well and want to do it better every day. And we're here to support that work.
Definitely.
Well, thank you, Jennifer. More to come on Ed Talks Live, and follow us, and we'll make more and more presence and more available all these resources to you. Join our forum, join our conversations, and be a part of this transforming and co-creating the new landscape of education. A big hug, Jennifer.
Same back to you.
Un abrazo, Gabi. Thank you all.
Bye. Thank you so much.
Bye. Thank you so much.